Time is everyone's enemy. In the world of video games, it's difficult to determine who knows this better, the dev working 60 hours a week to make sure their game ships on time, or the player returning to a 10-year-old game only to find out that it hasn't aged well. Today we'll be sympathizing with the latter and delving into the topic of video game aging. What causes games to age? Do they inherently age poorly? And what aspects of a game are timeless, if such a concept exists, and why? Aging is, of course, the effect that time has on a product. I began asking myself whether or not games had a tendency to age badly after playing a combination of titles. All of these games have aspects that have aged badly, yet managed to retain aspects that haven't. When asking the question of why things age and if they age unfavorably, I believe we have to split the aspects of the video games we play into two categories: the tangible and the intangible. The tangible is what we see when we play, and the intangible is what we feel. Thanks to Moore's Law being in full effect during the bulk of the lifetime of this medium, Moore's Law being the concept that computational power will double every 2 years, games have enjoyed a lengthy period of advances in rendering, animation, and modeling techniques. These advances usually sell us on new consoles and new hardware, but it's this very process that lends itself to the tangible aging badly. It's important now to establish the concept of standards. Aging is fundamentally built on the concept of changing standards, and therefore the idea that games look better every year also does a disservice to older games in the mind of a potential player. Why would I play a game where the character models and level geometry are blocky when I can play the newest game out with models containing higher poly counts? If the new standard looks so much better than the old standard, I think there may be an inherent bias there, but this isn't that simple. Aging within this context is perhaps, coincidentally, contextual. Texture resolutions and lighting techniques can play a big part in whether or not a game truly looks old. And this is where we get to the concept of something holding up. When something holds up, I believe that to mean that it matches the current standard at the time, or at least compares significantly enough. While games definitely get lost in time, that does not mean that the mandate given the hardware in that specific period is incapable of producing something beyond its own means. Think Crysis or any of the older PC games that were meant to be played on future hardware. Beyond that, like I said, texture resolutions play a big part in whether or not a game looks old. For example, most of the games that hold up had a lot of attention put into their normal map work. Normal maps are what give the illusion of depth within model geometry. So now the question becomes, why are there old games that hold up visually, and why are there old games that don't? This is due to a number of different factors. If a game was made for console, chances are it'll age quicker simply because of the limitations of fixed hardware in an industry where games are always advancing. Think about how developers had to deal with the allocation of memory and other assets during the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 eras, where the console simply couldn't get any more powerful. I think one of the more obvious examples of this is comparing Condemned Criminal Origins to F.E.A.R, both released in the same year, both by the same developer, yet one is clearly crisper than the other, likely due to F.E.A.R's primary development platform being the PC, and Condemned's primary development platform being the Xbox 360. One of these platforms could easily scale and adjust, and one couldn't. In this same vein, screen resolution plays a big part in whether or not it's viable to put bigger textures into a game for better looking environments and character models. The standard for 7 or 8 years was 1280 by 720. This meant that for your average character model, you'd have a texture that was 512 by 512 for their head and 1024 by 1024 for their body. This is all fine and good when you're playing on a small screen that's a couple of feet away from you at 720p, but once you step that up to 1080p and you're playing the game less than 2 feet away from you on a PC, you begin to notice the texture quality degrading. It's also due to this lack of power at any given time that some developers rely on what we know as pre-rendered cutscenes. These are generally the product of developers not being able to do cutscenes in a real-time environment because the platform isn't powerful enough. So they render everything on their side and convert it to video for your game. But this is likely an inherently flawed method, as these things were usually rendered to the standard resolution of their time and were already compressed and containing artifacts to begin with. Another big reason that some games don't visually age well is just due to design. If your game's aesthetic was designed around the standard at the time and doesn't contain enough elements to be timeless, a concept we'll expand upon later, then your game is pretty much doomed to age badly. A prime example of this would be Unreal Tournament 3. I like this game a lot, but its lack of visual clarity because of over-designed surfaces, weapon, and armor is horrible, and its mundane palette of brown, brown, and more brown was clearly the end thing during 2007, but that fad came and went. Money plays a big part in whether or not a game's visuals will age well or poorly also. It'd be hard to get very well-designed models if you don't have the money to pay the modelers. And finally, while I respect all the work developers put into a game, there's some developers who are just lazy and don't care about how the game looks or will look in the future. So you get nonsense like a 512 by 512 normal map on a body of an important character who's going to be featured prominently and will look horrible because that isn't enough resolution to properly convey detail on a body. Simply put, I don't think many people like things that look old, and while things will inevitably look old, there are methods that can circumvent the aging process. If the developer cares about scaling and how things will look 4 or 5 years from the game's release, I think there will definitely be an effort there to release a game that will hold up visually. But if they don't, the game likely won't, and when you boot it up on your PC and crank it up to 1080p, 1440p, or god forbid 4K, you're sure to be met with something that looks bad. None of this is to say that visuals are the most important aspect of a game or whether or not the game has aged well. There's also gameplay, which is susceptible to the same concept of standards. If you look back at least 10 years in any genre, you'll see that games back then were largely different. Video games are usually worked on for years and then shipped in an assumed perfect state within the context of that time period. By that, I mean that the dev will ship the game when they believe it to be in the best possible state it can be, but that state is limited by the information the developer has in that time frame. This information relative to the year of release can be a key component in whether or not a game ages well when the standard becomes something else. Why do tank controls generally not exist anymore? Because we found smoother ways to navigate fully three-dimensional spaces. I think you'll find that standards become standards when the replacement mechanic of a game is universally deemed better. Exceptions exist, but when the industry reacts to something and begins changing all of their games with a specific mechanic in mind, it's because the audience has accepted this and the reception, and more importantly, the sales, back that up. So now the question presents itself. Does the new standard make the old standard bad? Was the previous standard inherently bad but we just put up with it? Or was there merit in that previous standard and the changes totally unwarranted? The answer usually lies somewhere in the middle with most mechanics. No, the old standard wasn't bad, but the new standard is just a little more polished or something entirely new which doesn't necessarily conflict with the old standard, and both can exist in harmony. Also worth noting is that this standard change usually comes in the form of 1 or 2 games that spark innovation in their respective genres, and because of this, you'll get a wave of copycats that didn't understand why the standard bearer was successful and will just fail without adding anything new and doing the same thing worse. These games age poorly because of it. Additionally, aging doesn't have to be just looking back in retrospect and comparing mechanics. Sometimes aging can be shown just by comparing a game to its competition. Clive Barker's Jericho is a game that has aged like 40-year-old horse shit because it was outdated for its time, with its competition being the likes of Call of Duty 4, Halo 3, and BioShock. Games like these are the product of being late to the party and not the party having died down. This raises the question of whether or not a game's counterintuitive and borderline bad mechanics are dead on arrival and have no chance at aging well, period. While you can take measures to soften the blow of advancing technology in the visual aspect of games, Is something that wasn't fun to play in 2008 going to be fun to play in 2012 when the standard has inevitably shifted and your perception of what is good in a game has as well? Because that's what mechanical aging seems to come down to. If we perceive something to be a change for the better and provides an overall funner experience, the older experience that doesn't contain these elements may be viewed as lesser because of it. This is when we enter the intangible and what the concept of timeless is. Everything I've said so far likely assumes that we consider the new standard to be an inherent improvement over the old standard, but this is a patently subjective claim, as I myself can attest to. It's no secret that I don't like F.E.A.R 2 and prefer the original F.E.A.R over it. But why? F.E.A.R 2's lighting is more advanced, the geometry is of higher poly count, and yet it seems to be missing what made that first game so great. F.E.A.R has not aged well visually in certain aspects, like character models, but there's nothing like throwing a grenade at an enemy in slow motion and watching the shockwave ripple and your head bobble as you try to withstand the concussive force. In F.E.A.R 2, grenades don't explode on impact, so this is rarely seen. Is the ability to cook grenades an inherent improvement over grenades detonating on impact? No, and the answer applies when the two elements are flipped. This is the timeless, when a concept cannot be affected by time because it's in its purest form already. Another good example is Unreal, a game that, while I don't mind the look of, is clearly outdated. However, the moment you exit the Vortex Rikers and you realize that you're on an alien planet when you're introduced to Nylevi's Falls is everlasting to me. This is because while the method of presentation is susceptible to the effects of time, the idea is immune. The intangible is what you feel when you play a game, and even in their simplest forms, games have a lot to say and a lot to experience. I guess the timeless is better described as perfection, an idea in a standstill where it can be improved but doesn't need to be, because that's what we've been talking about this entire time, right? Games age because the bar is raised and a new standard is set. A new standard is perceived as an improvement over the old standard. An improvement suggests that all relevant information wasn't available at present time and adjustments can be made. In other words, games age because they aren't perfect, but some of their elements don't age because they are. So, do games inherently age poorly? Thanks for watching.